It was late 1959, and Frank Sinatra was throwing one of his infamous parties at his house in the Hollywood Hills. The place was packed with movie stars, musicians, producers, and various hangers-on. This was the golden age of Hollywood excess. Parties like this went until dawn. Drinks flowed freely. Boundaries were fluid. Dean Martin was there, as he usually was when Frank threw a party. He was leaning against the bar, nursing what looked like scotch, but was probably apple juice, talking to Sammy Davis Jr. about nothing in particular, just two friends killing time at a party. Marilyn Monroe arrived around midnight. She walked in wearing a white dress that seemed to glow under the lights. Conversation didn't stop. This was Hollywood. People were used to beautiful women. But heads turned. They always did when Marilyn entered a room. Dean noticed her arrival, but didn't make a big deal of it. He'd known Marilyn for years. They ran in the same circles. They were friendly, but not close. Dean treated her the way he treated most people, with casual warmth but careful distance. The party went on. People drank, people laughed. Frank played piano. Someone told a dirty joke that made half the room groan and the other half howl. Normal Rat Pack chaos. Around 2 in the morning, Dean decided he was done. He'd been there for hours, he'd done his socializing, and he had a wife waiting for him at home. Jean had long since gotten used to Dean's late nights, but he tried not to push it. He said goodbye to Sammy, found Frank to thank him for the party, and was heading toward the door when Marilyn Monroe appeared in front of him. She was alone. Her lipstick was slightly smudged. Her eyes were bright but unfocused in a way that suggested she'd had more than a few drinks. She smiled at Dean, that famous Marilyn smile that launched 1,000 magazine covers. "Dean," she said, "you're leaving?" "Yeah," Dean said. "It's late. Time to head home." Marilyn nodded slowly. Then she said, very clearly, loud enough that several people nearby could hear, "Dean, would you take me home?" The conversation around them didn't stop exactly, but it shifted. People who'd been talking suddenly seemed very interested in their drinks. A few heads turned, trying not to be obvious about watching. Dean looked at Marilyn. She was looking right back at him, her expression unreadable. Was this a test, a game, or was she serious? For 2 or 3 seconds, Dean didn't say anything. He just stood there, trying to read the situation. Marilyn Monroe, the most desired woman in the world, the woman every man in Hollywood wanted, had just asked him to take her home. And Dean Martin, who'd built a career on playing the charming drunk, the guy who always had a drink and a beautiful woman on his arm, was being tested in front of a room full of people who all knew his image. The silence stretched. People were definitely watching now, pretending not to, but watching. Finally, Dean spoke. His voice was calm, clear, not unkind, but absolutely firm. "Marilyn, you'll get a cab home. I'm going home to my wife." The room went completely silent. Someone's glass clinked against a table. It sounded like a gunshot. Marilyn stood there, frozen. Her smile was still on her face, but it had turned into something else, something harder to read. Shock, maybe, or embarrassment, or disbelief. She didn't say anything, just stood there, looking at Dean like she was waiting for him to laugh, to say he was kidding, to be the Dean Martin everyone expected. But Dean didn't laugh. He just looked at her with something that might have been sympathy and said, "Good night, Marilyn." And then he walked past her, out the front door, and into the night. The party didn't exactly stop, but it took a moment to recover. People started talking again, but in hushed tones. Marilyn stood there for another few seconds, then turned and walked to the bar. She ordered another drink, didn't look at anyone, didn't say anything. Frank Sinatra, who'd witnessed the whole thing from across the room, walked over to Dean's wife Jean the next day and told her what happened. "Your husband's either the bravest man in Hollywood or the craziest," Frank said. "Marilyn Monroe asked him to take her home, and he said no." Jean smiled. "That's Dean." "You're not surprised?" "Frank, Dean flirts. Dean makes it look like he's available. But that's the act. The real Dean, he comes home to me every night. Always has, always will. Frank shook his head. He turned down Marilyn Monroe. I know, and that's why I married him. The story spread through Hollywood like wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone had heard about it. The details changed in the telling. Some versions had Marilyn crying, others had Dean being cruel, a few claimed the whole thing was a publicity stunt, but the core remained the same. Marilyn Monroe had asked Dean Martin to take her home, and Dean Martin had said no. For Dean, it became one of those moments that defined how people saw him. The lovable drunk act was still there, but underneath it, people now saw something else: loyalty, integrity, a line he wouldn't cross. I got asked about it for years, Dean said in an interview in the 1980s. People wanted to know if I regretted it, if I ever wondered what would have happened. Did you? The interviewer asked. Dean smiled. Not for a second. I loved my wife, still do, even though she's gone now. And that night, I had a choice. I could go home to the woman I loved, or I could go home with the woman everyone else wanted. That's not really a choice. That's a test. And I passed it. What do you think Marilyn was doing? Was she serious? Dean was quiet for a moment. I think Marilyn was lonely. I think she was used to men saying yes to her. And I think maybe, just maybe, she wanted to see if there was a man in Hollywood who would say no, who would see her as a person instead of as Marilyn Monroe. Do you think she respected you for it? I know she did, because years later, at another party, she came up to me and said, "You were right that night. I should have taken a cab." And then she said something I never forgot. She said, "You were the only man who ever said no to me. I respected you for that." Dean paused, his expression becoming distant. And then she said something else. She said, "Do you know how lonely it is to be wanted by everyone but seen by no one?" And I didn't know what to say to that, because I realized that night at Frank's, when I turned her down, I wasn't just protecting my marriage, I was maybe the only person in that room who saw Marilyn as a human being instead of a trophy. And she knew it. That's what the respect was really about. Not that I said no, but that I saw her clearly enough to know she deserved better than what she was asking for. The interviewer was quiet for a moment. That's a heavy thing to carry. It is, Dean agreed, because 3 years after that conversation, she was dead. And I've wondered sometimes if anyone ever really saw her the way she needed to be seen, if anyone ever said no to her for the right reasons instead of just using her and saying yes. I hope someone did, but I don't know. All I know is that for one night, I treated her like a person instead of like Marilyn Monroe, and she never forgot it. Neither did I. The incident became legendary for what it said about both Dean and Marilyn. For Dean, it cemented his reputation as a man who, despite his playboy image, had clear boundaries, who knew what mattered and what didn't. For Marilyn, it became another example of her loneliness, of how she was surrounded by people who wanted her but couldn't see her, and of how the one man who said no might have been the one who saw her most clearly. Here's what people don't understand about that night, Sammy Davis Jr. said years later. Marilyn wasn't really asking Dean to take her home. She was asking if he was like every other man she'd ever met. And Dean told her the truth. He wasn't. That's what left her speechless. Not the rejection, but the honesty. The party at Frank's house continued until dawn that night. Marilyn left around 4 in the morning, alone, in a cab, just like Dean had suggested. Dean got home around 2:30. Jean was still awake, reading in bed. "How was the party?" she asked. Dean kissed her on the forehead. "Same as always. Too loud, too crowded, too much everything." "Marilyn was there, I heard." Dean looked at his wife. "Yeah, she was there." Jean studied his face. "Something happened. She asked me to take her home." Jean didn't react with shock or anger. She just nodded slowly. "And you said?" "I said I was going home to my wife." Jean smiled. "Good answer. only answer, Dean said. He got undressed and climbed into bed next to her. I love you, you know. I know. That's why you're here instead of wherever Marilyn is. They turned off the lights and went to sleep. And the next morning, when Dean woke up, he didn't think about Marilyn Monroe or what might have happened. He thought about the woman sleeping next to him, the woman he'd chosen, the woman he kept choosing. That's what the story of Marilyn Monroe asking Dean Martin to take her home was really about. Not about what Dean turned down, but about what he chose instead. In a town where infidelity was almost expected, where marriages were disposable and loyalty was rare, Dean Martin had drawn a line, and he'd done it publicly, in front of people who would talk, in a moment when saying yes would have been easy and saying no was hard. Marilyn Monroe was the most beautiful woman in the world, Frank Sinatra once said, and Dean turned her down, not because he didn't find her attractive, but because he loved someone else more. That's not weakness, that's strength. When Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, Dean Martin was one of the people who attended her funeral. He didn't speak, didn't make a show of his grief, just stood quietly in the back, paying his respects to someone he'd known, liked, and in his own way, respected. After the service, someone asked him if he regretted that night at Frank's party, if he wished he'd made a different choice. Dean looked at them like they'd asked the stupidest question in the world. "Why would I regret choosing my wife?" he said, and he walked away.
The story has been told and retold over the decades. It's become part of Hollywood mythology, the night Dean Martin turned down Marilyn Monroe. Different versions emphasize different aspects. Some focus on Dean's loyalty, others on Marilyn's loneliness. A few treat it as a missed opportunity or a tragic near miss. But the truth is simpler than any of those versions. Dean Martin was asked a question. He gave an honest answer, and that answer revealed something about his character that all the drunk act and playboy image couldn't hide. He was a man who knew what mattered, and he acted accordingly. Marilyn Monroe asked Dean Martin to take her home, and Dean Martin said no, not because he didn't like her, not because he was trying to be cruel, but because he had someone waiting for him at home who mattered more. And in Hollywood, in 1959, in a town built on illusion and betrayal and temporary connections, that was the most shocking thing anyone could do. Say no to Marilyn Monroe and go home to your wife. That's what left Marilyn speechless. Not the rejection itself, but the realization that there was a man in Hollywood who meant what he said, who lived what he claimed to believe, who chose loyalty over opportunity. Dean Martin was that man, and that night at Frank Sinatra's party, he proved it. Years later, when people asked Dean about his marriage, about how he and Jean stayed together in a town where marriages fell apart constantly, he'd smile and say, "I made a choice. Every day, I made the same choice, to go home to her, to choose her. And that choice got easier every time I made it." Even when Marilyn Monroe was the alternative, someone once asked. Dean laughed, especially then, because that's when the choice mattered most. That's the real story of the night Marilyn Monroe asked Dean Martin to take her home. Not a story about rejection or missed opportunity, but a story about choosing what matters, about knowing yourself well enough to know what you won't compromise, about being the same person in private that you pretend to be in public. Dean Martin was a lot of things: a singer, a comedian, an actor, a drunk, or at least someone who played one on TV. But more than any of that, he was a man who knew what he valued, and when tested, in front of a room full of people who expected him to fail, he didn't. He just said no and went home to his wife. That's what left Marilyn Monroe speechless, and that's what made the story worth telling.